Mark Rogers, TV talking Ohio State football each and every Wednesday night with Brandon Zimmerman from the Buckeye Battle Cry. And as we break down positions, not just with Ohio State, but across the country, if you want to talk about a position that would be in the running for best positional unit potentially in 2017, it's Ohio State along the defensive front. Brandon, this is a group that's loaded, not just with talent, but guys that have already produced at a high level.
Yeah, if there was a strong point for the Buckeyes coming into this year, it's definitely the defensive line. You look, they are 3-4 deep at some spots. They've got Coach Larry Johnson, who's considered one of the best in the business. Everyone coming back from last year, which is kind of a surprise. Guys like Tyquan Lewis, you kind of expected to move on. Even Jalyn Holmes had a great year, and you would not have been shocked if he would have moved on. But they're all coming back. So at least first and second team have proven themselves. Third team is right there and could start for most teams. So big year for the defensive line. You would consider it a strength. But looking at, stats from last year, they do need to take a bigger step than they did last year. Finishing in the bottom half of the Big Ten in sacks and tackles for loss is not something you would expect for a defensive line led by numerous future first and second round picks. So it's a big year for them to kind of prove what they can do, and also for Larry Johnson to get them kind of motivated. A bunch of 5-star top-rated guys and get them all on the same page of only playing part-time, because he rotates in, 10 to 12 guys through that line. So sometimes the egos might jump in the way sometimes, but, it's just getting them all going forward.
Yeah, let's move from the outside in, because you mentioned some of these guys. Tyquan Lewis, who comes into a redshirt senior year, had 10.5 tackles for loss. Nick Bosa is obviously the guy that everybody talks about because of the name recognition, but he came in and made big plays. He had 5 sacks. Chase Young is a kid that shouldn't necessarily need to see the field, coming in as a top recruit out of Maryland as the number 2 rated weak side defensive end. Sam Hubbard, Jalyn Holmes. The list goes on with guys that have produced on the field, but what you just pointed out in regards to big plays in the opponent's backfield and the lack of them out of this group is just astonishing.
Yeah, it's, it seemed like they were always a second too late. And with defensive lines, you can't always go off of pure stats. It is not always about sacks. It's not always about tackles for loss. Those are obviously the flashy thing that you can look at. What the Buckeyes do a lot of is occupying space, freeing up the linebackers, which they usually have some pretty athletic guys out there, such as the Jerome Bakers and the Darren Lees and the Shaziers. So a lot of times the defensive linemen are pure there to kind of take up 1 or 2 of the linemen and let the McMillans and all the linebackers run free. But at some point, especially against guys like Mayfield and Watson, where you need the defensive ends to kind of make that happen and put some pressure on them and kind of help out. It just seemed like they were a second too late last year. There was a lot of pressure, a lot of hits on the quarterbacks, but it seemed like the quarterback just got it off just in time. Granted, offenses kind of know what kind of defensive line the Buckeyes have. So there's a lot of quick throws, a lot of wide receiver screens and running back screens that the ends have to watch for. So you can't always go off of stats and base that on how good the defensive line was last year. But it is something that you think they would like to move up on.
Totally agree. And to your point, let's say the average team runs 70 plays a game. You play a 12 or 13 or 14 game season. You're seeing 800, 900 plays. And let's say one guy gets 10 sacks, another guy gets 5 sacks. Well, we make this huge distinction. Oh, somebody got double-digit sacks. Well, that's only 10 plays out of 700 plays. And obviously he's only on the field about half the time because of rotations. But there's just indication that if the guy got 10 sacks and 13 or 14 tackles for loss, then there were a whole bunch of other times that he was pressuring the quarterback, making him throw early, had his arm on his shoulder, was dragging him down, all those sorts of things. So it's kind of a small sample size of actual stats that go into the book, but you kind of assume that gives indication to other plays that are being made.
Yeah, and Joey Bosa back 2 years ago is a perfect example for that. Is, stats wise, Joey Bosa did not have a great year, but if you actually watch the games, I mean, Bosa was taking on 2 or 3 guys and still getting pressure onto the quarterback and the running back as soon as they were touching the ball. So stats aren't always the guideline that you need to go for the defensive line. Joey Bosa was doing all of that, and meanwhile, Tyquan Lewis was able to go one-on-one, and I believe Tyquan Lewis back 2 years ago had 10.5 sacks or somewhere around there. So, and Bosa only wound up with, I think, 5.5. So stats that don't always say how good a defensive line is, and I think that's the case with last year when you see that the Buckeyes finished so far down in the Big Ten, not only in the nation, but in the Big Ten as far as stats wise goes. But you look at guys like Tyquan Lewis and Jalyn Holmes, Jonathan Cooper, who you didn't even mention, which is funny because, I mean, he's a 5-star guy, was one of the top defensive ends, but he's so buried on that Buckeye line because there's so many great players that people don't even think about him. So Jonathan Cooper and Chase Young are both freshman guys that I think are going to be big parts of the team this year, and that's not even counting the Nick Bosas and the Jalyn Holmes and Sam Hubbard. So defensive end's pretty stacked for the Buckeyes right now.
Yeah, inside, maybe not quite as stacked, but definitely plenty of players there. Michael Hill, Tracy Sprinkle, probably the starters. Robert Landers, a guy that I really like, who maybe not later in the season was much of a factor, but made some big plays the first half of the season. Just a redshirt sophomore coming into 2017, had 8 tackles for loss. Malik Barrow, redshirt freshman, who may get some playing time as well.
Yep, and another guy there was a big one was Draymond Jones, who stepped in last year as a redshirt freshman. I believe he had 10.5 tackles for loss. Came in and started after Tracy Sprinkle got hurt. So that's going to be the really big competition on the defensive tackle spot this year, I think, is Sprinkle and Draymond Jones for that starting spot. I think Michael Hill has the other tackle spot locked down. Robert Landers played great last year as another freshman. There were times where he showed a lot of flash, looked like Hankins did for the Buckeyes back a few years ago. So I think those 4 guys are going to be the main rotation at defensive tackle. But like you said, I would not be surprised if Tracy Sprinkle and Michael Hill were the starters, with Draymond Jones and Robert Landers getting a lot of playing time, just like at defensive end where they rotate a bunch of people. That's not even factor in guys like Jashawn Cornell, who was a 5-star guy coming out, I think 2 or 3 years ago, who started off as a defensive end, has moved into the tackle spot. Malik Barrow, like you said, a 4-star guy that came out of Florida. Davon Hamilton, who was another 4-star guy that got a lot of playing time last year and also showed flashes as a freshman. This year they had Haskell Garrett come in. So he'll be a true freshman trying to work his way into. So the defensive line's pretty stocked at defensive tackle and defensive end. Not as flashy at tackle as they are at end, but a bunch of really solid guys there that should be pretty decent this year.
Yeah, Haskell Garrett, one of the pipeline from Las Vegas, 4th-rated player out of the state and number 6 defensive tackle in the entire nation. Jerron Cage, top 15 defensive tackle as well. We may not see from those guys, but based on the number of players that work through the rotation, maybe we will.
Yep.
So the line is fortified both inside and outside, with definite speed and talent on the outside to see some havoc being wreaked from offenses in the Big Ten and hopefully Oklahoma early in the season as well. So the defensive line stacked for the Buckeyes. Brandon Zimmerman from the Buckeye Battle Cry, breaking down position by position. We'll get you set for spring practice here coming up in about a month. Thanks, Brandon.
All right. Thanks for having me, Mark.